The beauty of beekeeping and the joy of it is the peace and serenity you find as a beekeeper spending a day at the apiary. You'll hear from vegetable farmers when they're walking through the vegetable field in the early morning hours, taking notes on their crops, and they look out over that sprawling salad mix, and they're excited. They're at peace. They hear the birds chirping. And the same is with an apiary. You walk into an apiary early in the morning and you see the bees just initially flying out of their hives up over the treetops to go out and forage. The sunlight's catching, tens of thousands of bees flying out. There's something beautiful about that is beyond it's almost undescribable, but you feel at peace. You feel happier as a human being around bees.
Hey everybody, welcome to ATTRA's Voices from the Field podcast. I'm really happy to be here today with Eric Fuchs-Stengel, and my name is Rhinehart, and I work out of Pennsylvania, taking care of mostly the mid-Atlantic area. I deal with livestock issues, crops, cover crops, an awful lot of pasture management type questions, and do a lot of writing for ATTRA. For those of you who may be joining us for the very first time, what is ATTRA? What is NCAT? Well, we're a national nonprofit. NCAT's a national nonprofit that manages the ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. It's a national free service that provides technical assistance and education in sustainable agriculture to farmers and ranchers and educators nationwide. We have a website, attra.org, ATTRA.org, where you can access all of our publications and videos and podcasts like this one. So that's kind of a little bit about us, national nonprofit, doing this work. Without further ado, I'd really like to introduce Eric Fuchs-Stengel. I've had the pleasure of working with Eric for the last couple of years. He's in our New Jersey office and very knowledgeable in small-scale, intensive agriculture, market gardening, especially beekeeping. Eric, thank you for being here, man.
Lee, thank you for having me today on the podcast. I think today is going to be a lot of fun. I've been wanting to and been excited about doing a beekeeping podcast here on Voices from the Field for a long time. There's a lot to go over today, right? Because a podcast on bees doesn't nearly give us enough time. We need weeks and weeks of time of podcasts to really cover beekeeping in depth. But what are we going to cover today, and why beekeeping? And most importantly, what's my history in beekeeping? And what have I been up to? At NCAT, I think when I first got hired here, my focus was in small-scale vegetable production and urban farming, because that's where I started. In addition to that, when you start doing urban farming, what tends to happen is you wind up doing urban beekeeping. That seems to be what kind of where my career went. I started farming, gardening, doing urban gardens, community gardens, and then it transformed into a high-intensity beekeeping operation on the side of that. So my work's predominantly with nonprofit organizations, beekeeping on a small scale. When I first got started, I started with 2 hives just in a backyard. And at peak, I was running about 25 Langstroth-style beehives across 3 different farm properties in northern New Jersey, in the Bergen County, New Jersey area, in the suburbs of New Jersey. So that's my context. So at peak, I was running 25 hives, and I was very good at killing my bees. So that number changed a lot. So I was at 25, and then 10, and then 15, and then 14, and then 20 again. I think what I'm going to cover today when we do this podcast will basically be how to get started, how to keep your bees alive. What are the basics? What equipment do we need? What do we need to learn? What do we need to study to be good beekeepers? And then a really good thing to talk about is the common mistakes that beginning beekeepers make, which is something I know really well because I made them all several times over because beekeeping is tricky. It is a craft like anything else. And to do it well, you really need to master it and study it with that in mind.
Eric, there's an awful lot. And you said that you're a bee killer, and I think every beginning beekeeper is probably a bee killer, and probably even some established ones as well, right? Goodness, mites and all the things you're going to talk about, that overwintering issues or whatever. Well, then what keeps you motivated to do this? I
think the beauty of beekeeping and the joy of it is the peace and serenity you find as a beekeeper spending a day at the apiary. You'll hear it from vegetable farmers when they're walking through the vegetable field in the early morning hours, taking notes on their crops, and they look out over that sprawling salad mix, and they're excited. They're at peace. They hear that birds chirping. And the same is with an apiary. You walk into an apiary early in the morning and you see the bees just initially flying out of their hives up over the treetops to go out and forage. The sunlight's catching, tens of thousands of bees flying out. My favorite thing to do in the morning was to sit there with a cup of tea, and tea with honey, of course, and watch the bees just fly out right as I started my work on the apiary. And there's something beautiful about that is beyond the it's almost undescribable, but you feel at peace. You feel happier as a human being around bees. And so that at the soul level is why I like doing it. Certainly every beekeeper kills a lot of bees in their beginning years, and it's embarrassing. In fact, it's a faux pas to talk about it. It's a taboo to talk about it, right? And the best beekeepers do, but many smaller scale beekeepers and hobbyists and sideliners don't want to mention that they kill their bees, or that they made a mistake, or that they did this, because it's embarrassing. Everyone wants to present as the expert, the ultimate expert in beekeeping, when we're all just beginners. In reality, there's very few expert beekeepers out there. So I think it's important to be a good beekeeper. You have to embrace the fact that you're going to make mistakes and kill your bees. Just like as a vegetable grower, my other side of my life, when I destroyed a crop by accident, when I got a pest infestation, I wasn't embarrassed. I asked other farmers for help. I went out and said, hey, I have a flea beetle all over my arugula. What do you guys do to manage it? I find with beekeepers, there's much less willingness to do that. I don't know why, but I think in certain circles, there's openness around it. But a lot of times people are very secretive when they kill their bees, because they feel shame over it. So the joy outweighs the sadness of losing hives, I would say.
I think we should have probably named this episode Zen in the Art of Beekeeping.
Yeah, definitely. There's a little bit of a movement. I would say a fairly obvious movement in beekeeping with veterans. And I've seen a lot of veteran beekeepers show up out of the woodwork in the last decade. And programs like the Heroes to Hives program at Michigan State University, and likewise another program with a very similar name, the Hives for Heroes program, which is a nonprofit organization working across the United States. These are two different groups that are working with veterans in beekeeping. And I have seen a lot of vets who have had issues with PTSD and trauma find real peace with bees in a way maybe they couldn't with vegetables and in other places in their life. So that Zen concept, there's real world practical applications for healing through beekeeping. I think the last thing to mention on that, or important thing to mention, is that the reason for that is that bees provide an instant response to how you interact with them. If you're at a hive and you're stressful and a little angry, sweating profusely, so you're putting out these alarm pheromones, these strong smells. Bees have an extremely good sense of smell. They smell your sweat, they smell your fear, they smell your anger, and that bothers them. When you're holding a frame and you're shaking or you're nervous, that's shaking the frame, that's shaking the bees. They communicate through vibration, through buzzing, through smell. They pick up on a beekeeper very quickly and will check you in a good way if you're not being respectful. And if you're not being present. So you do something foolish with a hive, you are going to usually get stung. You feel calm and at ease with your hive, you're usually going to have a great day in the apiary. And likewise, if you approach a hive with a lot of aggression and you're throwing your hive boxes around and pulling frames out and smashing them into each other, that will upset not just your hive, that'll upset the apiary. And before you know it, you're being swarmed with bees. You got your veil getting smacked in the face with all these forager bees that are angry. And the scene goes from one of peace and serenity to a tornado. And if you end your day, running out of your apiary with bees stinging you in the back of the head, that's a very intense moment for you, and one that makes you reflect on what you're really doing there. And I've had that experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you've told me about some of your experiences before, and it makes me wonder. It's like, what is the first sign that you will see from an upset hive? I mean, what are some of the behaviors they'll start to exhibit that you might know, okay, I better just, put the top back on this and walk away?
Yeah, this is a great question. Well, a good example would be I would say even before you get to a hive, and I know we haven't even gotten into exactly what type of bees we're raising, which is honeybees, Apis mellifera, the Western honeybee predominantly here in the United States. Predominantly, I say predominantly because the world raises different types of honeybees. We raise Apis mellifera. So if you're walking up to a traditional Langstroth colony, I can start to pick up on it if a hive is going to be defensive before I get anywhere near the hive. So if the day is rainy and gray and cloudy, I shouldn't even be at the apiary that day. I should not be opening a beehive in a wet, rainy day. So that's the first warning sign. If I'm approaching a hive for some reason on that day, they're not going to be in the best mood. Bees are creatures of the sun. They live by the sun. They plan their days by the sun. They plan their seasons by the sun. The longer the sunlight's out, the more they're foraging, the happier they're going to be, and also depending on the time of year. So if I get to a hive and I crack it open with a hive tool and there's a really intense ring of propolis around it that cracks open with that loud snap as I open the hive up, that's already telling me that that hive has a propensity to defend itself. It has covered the entire hive with propolis to much more of a degree than normal, which means that these bees maybe a little bit more on the defensive side. Now, that could also be a genetic trait that they're a little bit more on the hygienic side. So I'm not going to judge them right off of that, but I am going to notice that propolis, thick layer of propolis, can often signify they're ready for battle. They're defending themselves. Crack the hive, a lot of propolis. Then as I'm lifting the hive, I'll hear a bloom up of loud buzzing. That's telling me, all right, this hive is aware of me. They're already getting ready for me to enter. I haven't even added any smoke into the colony. I'll put smoke into that hive, and if I put smoke in there and as the smoke trickles down, I hear more loud buzzing. That again signifies to me that they're on edge. Not to mention, if they're buzzing louder, that means they're usually fanning their wings. And if they're fanning their wings, they can fan the smoke out of the hive. So that means that they're going to be more present for me. They're not going to be as affected by the smoke. So I don't want them fanning the smoke out because I need that smoke to distract them. And then most certainly the obvious answer, which most new beekeepers could tell you, you open the hive up and you smell bananas. And bananas is the pheromone of honeybees. That's the alarm pheromone. It has the same chemical composition as bananas, the smell of bananas ripening, and it's released out of the, I believe it's the Karashinkov gland, which is by the stinger of the honeybee. And if they're releasing that banana alarm pheromone into the air, that means they're already telling each other that it's time to defend the hive, and there's a bear here. We're going after that bear. Or if you're a beekeeper, there's a beekeeper here. We're going after that beekeeper. And then they'll proceed to the next levels of escalation will be forager bees flying at you and kind of smacking into your veil or your bare face if you're not wearing a veil. They're not necessarily stinging you, but they're hitting you to tell you back up, like back up, get at you, step away. And then if you don't take the hint at that point, they will proceed to sting you. And once you get one, you get more, because once one bee stings, it's going to leave an alarm pheromone on your skin, and that'll attract other bees to sting in that area.
You've been throwing around a whole lot of words here, things like Langstroth and propolis and all this stuff. And I know you're going to go into, maybe this is the point to kind of move into some of those details and such.
Yeah, I would love that, because it is important to get a little context for what we're doing before we get into the philosophy of it. Let's do that, but let's do it in a way that gives us time for discussion, right? Beyond just the basics of it, because there's plenty of places to go for learning the basics of beekeeping. But I will just hit a few things to mention. So as a beekeeper in the United States, we're raising Apis mellifera, the Western honeybee. The genus is Apis, the species is mellifera, and the family is Apidae. So what does that actually mean? Mellifera means honey bearer. So meli means honey, fera means bearer. So the honeybee is a bearer or the maker of honey. There are other types of honeybees. There's Apis cerana, the eastern honeybee, which is commonly raised in Asia and Japan. There's Apis dorsata, the giant honeybee, and there's the giant honeybee is often seen in National Geographic a lot. They'll see big clusters of huge honeybees in Nepal and in India on the side of cliff faces, which are just a sight to behold. There's, of course, also the bumblebee, right? That's our native North American pollinator and our very important addition to all of our farms, which is the genus Bombus. And then we're dealing with things like solitary bees and yellow jackets it's important to remember as a beekeeper, we need to be educated on all types of pollinators and bees so that we can educate properly about our role as a beekeeper. And that's because a lot of people recently have been talking about how Apis mellifera, the Western honeybee, could be outcompeting local native bees like solitary bees and bumblebees and all these native pollinators. I haven't seen the research to support that personally. I've looked to try to understand more about that. I think the Xerces Society is doing good work around that, but I personally don't necessarily agree. I don't just adopt that yet. I need more evidence to say, oh yeah, honeybees are outcompeting our native pollinators. All the evidence I've seen basically says that they're working in coexistence. My catchphrase for myself as a beekeeper is, I am honored with the opportunity to practice the stewardship of the vitality of the bees. And that's my motto when I think about my beekeeping practice. I'm working in tandem with bees and I'm stewarding them to be healthy and have vitality. Bees can fly. So no matter what type of operation you have, it's a very unique thing, right? Like bees can fly. So if you mess up with the way you're beekeeping, your bees will impact all the beekeepers around you and the native bees around you. There's this mobility to bees that is not always seen in cattle or in poultry, right? They can't fly necessarily miles away without your control. So because of that, we have a responsibility to be aware of our impact on others, right? Just as you wouldn't want to harm your neighbor by burning your house down, and then their house is connected, in the city, and you're burning their house down. You also want to make sure your hives are healthy, because if your hives die, that's going to impact the surrounding bees. Predominantly, if your hives died of varroa mite and your hive is overwhelmingly full of varroa mites, and your hives die, the neighboring bees will rob your hive out, and in doing so, will remove varroa from your colonies and take it back to their own. Likewise, if you are breeding a very unhealthy and sickly colony that has something in it like European foul brood, which is a bad disease, and your hives die, your neighbor's hives will come and rob it out, stealing things like pollen and honey that's left over from your bees, and also bringing that disease back to their colonies as well. I am interlinked with every surrounding beekeeper, which means I not only need to know those other beekeepers in my area to the best of my ability, but I need to care for them through my practices on my own farm, at my own apiary. Which brings us to the really important next point, which is education and understanding where to go to start. The best place to start is your local beekeeping association. Every state has a beekeeping association. New Jersey, it's the New Jersey Beekeepers Association. Pennsylvania, we have the Pennsylvania Beekeepers Association. If you're really serious about beekeeping and you want to do it right, you become a member of your beekeeping association before you get bees, before you get equipment, and you start attending meetings and going to their courses and lectures that they have usually monthly or weekly where you live. The next step is taking a good course on beekeeping before you start. Rutgers University has a beginning beekeeping course that's outstanding. Pennsylvania, I believe it's Penn State has a great beekeeping course. And then Cornell University has a lot of resources on beekeeping, and the Master Beekeeping program there, which is a high-level program for someone who's been beekeeping for a while. I can't recommend that enough. And then just to touch on, there's a multitude of great books that you can read. But some two notable ones, for example, is Natural Beekeeping by Ross Conrad and Raising Resilient Bees by Eric and Joy McEwen. These are all well-written, well-sourced, great books. And then on YouTube and other, obviously NCAT, we can support you with resources as well. But if you're looking to really deep dive, on YouTube, you can go to like the National Honey Show, which has a multitude of lectures from industry beekeeping experts that you can learn from. And then, of course, Randy Oliver and scientificbeekeeping.com is another great resources. To be honest, Randy Oliver is kind of the one of the leading voices in good beekeeping practices today. And he has a lot of wisdom. And he does podcasts everywhere. He does lectures everywhere. He's got tons of YouTube videos out there. So if you're looking for someone who you can trust that gives you good information on beekeeping, Randy Oliver would be a good place to start. Other important things to touch upon for getting started if you want to get going with bees is how much it's going to cost, what do you need, and what type of beehive should you be using, where you're getting your bees from. So I always recommend Langstroth colonies are the place to start. Langstroth hives are the place to start. That's because it's the most common beehive. I believe it's Lorenzo Langstroth came up with the concept of bee space, which is basically, I don't remember the exact dimensions. I should. Oh, no, maybe I do. Oh, yes, I have it here. So Minister Lorenzo Langstroth came up in 1851 with the concept of bee space, which is 5/16 of an inch. So bees will build comb in spaces larger than 3/8 of an inch, and they'll fill any space smaller than 1/4 of an inch with propolis. So he realized that if he could space frames out at the perfect distance apart, bees would not connect them. And that was the birth of the Langstroth colony, or the removable frame colony, which was a revolution in beekeeping. Prior to this, in order to inspect a colony or to take honey, you would wind up killing the colony, usually in the process, because you'd be tearing apart bee comb. But by having removable frame hives, Langstroth colonies, we're able to take care of bees in a way that's sustainable and long lasting, and has led to the beautiful abundance of beekeeping today. So you want to start with Langstroth hives. You want to be a member of your beekeeping club. And where are you going to purchase your equipment? Typically from websites like Dedant.com or BetterBee.com or Walter T. Kelly. These are mainstream, Man Lake's another one. These are mainstream beekeeping supply companies that sell to everyone at all different scales. I would recommend starting with two Langstroth hives in your backyard if you're going to be a hobbyist or a sideliner.
So these Langstroths, these I'm envisioning, these are your typical stackable, square type hives that we see most common, right?
Yes.
Because there's various types, but you're recommending this is the one to start with.
Absolutely. And that's because when you're first starting out of beekeeping, you're trying to learn how to be a beekeeper. What does that mean? It doesn't mean experimenting with ultra sustainable, regenerative, different biodynamic, or all these crazy things. I'm all about all of that, but that's the master level. That's when you're a couple of years in, 5 years in, 7 years in, and you know what you're doing. Then you switch it up. Then you start doing experimental stuff. Everybody wants to go for the experimental stuff at the beginning. And you set yourself off on a course for failure because you're alone in that. Beekeepers are going to be raising in traditional Langstroth hives, and you can learn the most by copying them at the beginning. So that's it. So yes, so when you're thinking about beehives and you imagine one in any picture, even if you Google image a beehive, that's what's going to come up as a Langstroth colony.
Okay, so also, why don't you, now I think you've said propolis like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
So give us a little context here, bro. What's going on?
Yeah. Which is perfect because you know what? We need to talk a little bit about like what is actually in a Langstroth hive and what's inside that piece of, the square wood that you see out there in some farmer's field. And what is in there, in addition to living bees, is wax, propolis, wood. So propolis is the resin that bees collect from the underside of tree bark and from the unopened flower buds. If you ever look at a bouquet of flowers and you see on the little closed buds, they look have a little glue on them, a little sheen to them. That is propolis. That's this sticky substance that bees will collect. And they collect it just like they do pollen or nectar. They will go and pry it off from the underside of bark or off of flower buds. They'll stick it onto their legs, and they'll come back to the hive with these wads of propolis on their legs that are so sticky, other bees will have to pull them off of them. And then they use that propolis as a paint, I would say, and they cover every surface of the colony in propolis, every piece of wood, every inch of a frame, even over their beeswax comb, they will coat it with propolis. It has antimicrobial properties. It serves to reduce bad bacteria buildup in the colony. And it also keeps the hive tight and sealed together to avoid drafts and to avoid excess wind and moisture creep into the colony. So propolis is a staple of a beehive, just as wax is. Wax is made by the bees from their abdomens. They have wax glands. And after about, I believe it's 12 days of life as a worker bee, the wax glands are fully developed and they actually will salivate out, if you will, wax onto their abdomen that will hang there as platelets. And the bees will pull those platelets off. They'll chew it up and add a little saliva to it. And it becomes like cement, if you will, but liquid cement. And they will mold that into bee comb. And then that will kind of harden into wax, into actual beeswax. So bees produce wax from their abdomens. It's a miracle of nature, I feel. And they only produce it when they need it. So if it's a colony that's growing rapidly and has a lot of food coming in, and it's the right time of year, then those bees at 12 days old will start really pumping out wax on their wax glands. But not every bee will do this. It depends on the age of the bee. And it also depends on the needs of the colony. If you have enough wax and the colony's not growing at a rapid rate, those bees won't produce wax from their wax glands. And then, of course, a Langstroth hive is made of wood, right? We produce it from, rough cut lumber that's made. Usually bee supply companies will send you unassembled frames, and you'll assemble them in your garage with a little wood glue and some nails or staples. And you can also buy all this stuff assembled, and they can send it to you assembled. It's cheaper to buy this stuff unassembled, but you can always buy them assembled if you want. So that's kind of the basic parts. Besides the bees themselves, we got wax, we have propolis, and we have wood inside a Langstroth colony. So I can take us a little deeper into what equipment you would need and what you might buy, how much it would cost. So to start off with 2 Langstroth hives in your backyard as a beginning beekeeper, you're looking at spending right around a little over $2,000 if you are buying these hives retail from, Dedant.com. You're brand new, you don't have any other equipment. And that's going to cover things like all the pieces of that colony, which is your outer cover, your inner cover, your honey supers, your deeps, your bottom board, your screen bottom board. It's going to cover things like your bee suit, both a full bee suit and a half-size bee suit. It's going to cover things like a smoker, varroa mite management chemicals such as oxalic acid or formic acid. It's not going to, that $2,000 cost isn't going to factor in things like sugar if you're feeding your bees in the early spring, or an electric fence, or if you have a lot of bear pressure, for example, or land access. Some beekeepers don't have a backyard for raising bees. They're going to have to rent land somewhere. $2,000 to start out with beekeeping with 2 Langstroth colonies is kind of what you're expecting to get into it. And as you get larger and larger in your scale, you tend to not want to buy brand new, fresh, clean equipment from a retail supplier. You do want to buy the used stuff off of Facebook Marketplace. But here's the thing. You have to know what you're buying. You have to be cautious about what you're buying. For example, actually not for example, let me give you the gradient there. If you can meet the beekeeper that used that equipment and ask them why they're getting rid of it, and ask them if they had any significant disease pressure in the past, that is worth its weight in gold. I'd buy that equipment if that beekeeper tells you, I haven't had any significant disease pressure. I'm getting rid of it because I'm moving and I'm just not going to keep beekeeping. The only thing I had happen was I had some varroa mites that killed my hives. If there's no bees in that hive equipment for a year, there's not going to be varroa mite in there. Varroa mite needs brood cells from honeybees that are alive to survive. So just as an empty beehive is free of bees, eventually it'll also be free of varroa. So you just want to make sure that there wasn't any significant disease. The disease that we're worried about is American foul brood. And if you find American foul brood in your beehive, you have to burn it because it is so bad and can spread so rapidly and can kill so much. So American foul brood is what you're worried about. But it's rare. It's rare now because beekeepers have done a good job of getting rid of it. But its spores can last for an enormous amount of time in a hive. For example, if your grandpa has some old bee equipment in his back barn and he tells you that he had some weird disease that wiped them all out 10 years ago, that would raise suspicion to me. I would be cautious of buying that equipment. I purchased a ton of old equipment from a beekeeper that had been out of the business for a decade, and he had it stored up in an old barn. But his name was Jack, and I asked Jack a lot about it, but he did explain to me that he knew he didn't have American foul brood. He just hadn't been a beekeeper for a long time, so he had it all stored in his barn. But even in that situation, what I wound up doing was sterilizing the equipment. So that's a ton of labor and time, and looking back on it, it wasn't worth the money I saved. So I probably bought 30 Langstroth hives worth of equipment, which is a lot of equipment. And I had to use a blowtorch and a garden torch for flame weeding, to burn out the insides of all those boxes and sterilize the inside of every single deep box I purchased, just in case there was American foul brood. It took a ton of time. And at the end of the day, I didn't save that much money. And the frames, the old bee frames, are almost always thrown away. If someone's giving you frames that are pocketed with wax moth and are covered in mold, that's going in the garbage. You're not using that. However, if you trust some a beekeeper you're buying from, and they're giving you frames with wax in them, which is a great opportunity if you trust them and they understand what they're doing, because you have to be cautious. Again, wax is where those diseases are spreading. So if you're getting a bunch of frames that have beeswax comb in there, you really need to understand the management situation that those bees were going through. Also, if they were using any harsh synthetic chemicals, that's going to uptake into the wax, and that will come to your hives now when you buy that wax comb from that beekeeper. So you're trying to be organic, but you've gotten wax comb from a beekeeper that was raising bees with a lot of things like apivar and all these other toxic synthetic chemicals that people use to treat mites. Well, that's going to now be in your colony, even if you're using organic treatments like formic acid and oxalic acid. You can also freeze your hives. You can freeze your equipment, which is a really good way to do it that's totally organic. That's for Varroa. That's not going to kill necessarily American foul brood.
So, okay, there's various scales, right, that somebody could be at in their beekeeping journey, right? Large, small, micro. I'm thinking about my place here, less than half of an acre, lots of perennials and vegetable gardens and things like this in a wood lot. What are some of the considerations I would have to do, or somebody on a small scale like this, whether they're a hobbyist, a homesteader, small market garden, because I start thinking about, where do I place these, these hives? Where's the best place to put them? Up against the woods? Should I be worried about the neighbors? What are some of those considerations that I should be thinking about if I'm going, man, it'd be cool to have some hives?
Definitely. And that's the question I get the most, right? Is how to get started with bees. And the answer is you're going to get the best answers from your beekeeping association, because they know your area, they know your environment, they know the weather patterns, they know your forage, they know the plants that are blooming and blossoming, they know who's beekeeping in your neighborhood already and how they might be impacting your hives. So I encourage you, there's nothing wrong with joining your beekeepers association, even if everyone who's part of that association is raising bees in a more conventional style. They might be using more synthetic chemicals. That's fine. Start with that beginning level teaching, and you can branch out later on, because how to beekeep is standard across the industry. How to do it in an organic fashion or a different way is not standard, but you need to know the basics to start. But let me give you some answers to those things, Lee. You're going to start with 2 hives in your backyard or 2 hives on your farm. If you want this to be an additional enterprise that your farm has, in addition, for example, to selling vegetables, that's a great thing, but you have to recognize it's a ton of work. It's not a side hustle. It's not a side business. It's not chill. It's going to be just as busy and involved as vegetable production. And I know that seems crazy for a vegetable producer to hear, but it is just as intense. And as someone who's doing it as a hobby, this is raising an animal. It's maybe not as intense as having a dog that you walk 4 times a day, but it's still a pet that you are now caring for in your backyard that requires your attention every day and requires your physical presence at least once to twice a week at the beginning. So when we're getting started with hives, if we're looking at that farm scale, small farm scale or hobbyist size, start with 2. In the Northeast, in New Jersey, I face my hives southeast, and I face them southeast so that I get that early morning sun in the wintertime. It warms the hive, gets off that morning mist off the colony, gets some of that moisture out in those winter days. We're going to lift our hives off the ground a little bit by about 1 foot. You're going to put them up on cinder blocks or wooden hive stands. We don't want them on the ground because moisture can wick up through the soil into the hive and freeze the hive out. And bees need to ventilate, and they need a little airspace below their colony to ventilate out. And it just is important to give them a little insulation. Also, things like raccoons and skunks will come up if they're on the ground and will actually eat the bees. So a little bit off the ground is good. Keep mice out, that type of thing. You're going to want a good windbreak. So if you have a farm field, like a cornfield, for example, and you drop your bees in the middle of it, you're going to kill your bees because the wind's going to whip across that field in the winter and freeze those bees to death. You need to figure out what sides are your prevailing wind, and you're going to build a nice dense fence on two sides of your colonies, or perhaps plant trees, native trees that are going to form a hedge buffer. But you need a windbreak for colonies. I like to raise beehives up near a forest, not in a forest, but next to one, because the trees will act as a natural buffer. You're going to need water, right? So bees drink water just like humans. They drink water through nectar, but they use water, which they will bring back to the colony and deposit on the frames to cool the colony. So they'll bring water back, they'll regurgitate it onto frames. That water will be fanned by the bees' wings and evaporate through the colony for water cooling, if you will, during the summer, heat of the summer. So they need a water source. If they don't have a good water source, they can go miles for water. And that is a diminishing return on your colony. So a bird feeder or a drum full of rocks and water is fine. It doesn't have to be super fresh water. It could be a little stagnant, little stinky, but flowing. Bees don't necessarily like super stinky, non-flowing water, but they also don't like super pure. They like the in between. They like a little bit of like a forest stream, if you will, that's constantly trickling along through the forest. That's ideal for bees. And you need to put something in that water. If it's a little bird feeder, put a little floaties in there, sticks and things. Bees can't just land on the water; they'll drown. They need to land on something and stick their tongues out, their proboscises out to drink. So face them southeast, have them off the ground. Have two, because you can compare one hive to the other. So if one is having issues, you can see what one looks like that's not having issues. If you have one, it's hard to know or have a barometer of how things are going. You want good sunlight. So don't have too much shade of the colony, right? Don't have it in a situation where you have a nice open backyard, but you put it so close to the trees that it's basically shaded year round. Bees need warmth, they need good sun, and they need sun in the entrance of their colony as early in the day as possible. And most importantly, you need forage. If there's a ton of beekeepers in your neighborhood and everybody's raising 10 colonies or hives behind their house, that's going to set you up for failure because there's a lot of competition for forage. And it's the forage that the honeybees specifically want. So you need to know how many other beekeepers are around you. What's the beehive density in your area? And if it's a ton of hives, I got to tell you, it's not the place to raise bees. You should go farther away. Urban beekeepers, there's lots of urban beekeepers in New York City, and I am skeptical as to how good those bees really can be because there's not a lot of forage. And if there is forage, they're getting it from, a spilt ice cream cone in the garbage or someone's soda. I mean, bees will go anywhere they need to get sugar and calories. And in the city, there's not as much forage and there's lots of beekeepers. So if your bees can't forage for food and forage for pollen, then you're going to provide that to them. And you're going to have to give them sugar water made from pure refined cane sugar. And you're going to have to give them pollen patties, which you can buy as a supplement from bee supply companies. And that's not a fun thing. It's not fun to feed your bees sugar water and pollen year round. So you need forage. And that's a big mistake that I made, is raising too many hives in one place and oversaturating the honeybee specific forage in that area, and subsequently having to keep my bees alive on sugar water year round. So
you're talking an awful lot, Eric, about forages and stuff. It makes me think, I'm thinking stuff like clover. What are some of the optimal forages that should be nearby, and how far should it be, and how much?
Exactly. So for example, every Beekeepers Association has a great list for you, right, for your area. But just to give you an example for New Jersey, right, different times of the year, there's going to be different forage blooming that's critical to bees' health. In early to mid-May in New Jersey, you're going to get crimson clover. May 20th to June 1st, you're going to get locust. Early June to mid-July, you're going to get white clover. Late July to early September, you're going to have rose mallow and swamp mallow. Late August to mid-October in New Jersey, we have the fall forage, fall flow as we call it. And you get goldenrod, late August to mid-October. In the early spring, forsythia is so important, right? You see forsythia bushes out there blossoming, and that's a sign that bees are getting their food. Even skunk cabbage can be a source of food for bees in the early spring. It's not always the most nutritious, but those are blossoms that the bees who've been struggling through the winter, that are really hungry going into spring, will hit early in the spring. So, snowdrops, alder, hazel, elm, poplars, these are all different forages for bees, and they have different color pollen as well. A really talented beekeeper can sit at the front of their colony and watch bees coming in with pollen on their legs and can actually identify what pollen is coming in based on the color of it, right?
Dude, that's insane.
Yeah, it is wild. I mean, like purple loosestrife will have that dark blue color on a bee's leg, while goldenrod will have a nice amber orange, dark orange color as it comes in on bees' legs. So that's what beekeeping is all about. It's observing. In fact, I would say beekeeping is about doing less and observing more, while the tendency for beginning beekeepers is to do way too much and not observe at all. With that in mind, let's talk a little bit about like some of the common failures and mistakes that beginning beekeepers make. As I've told you guys, like I've done them all, and there's nothing wrong with admitting it. Like I've made all these mistakes, and so I know them so well, but I see them replicated time and time again with new beekeepers. So let me pull up my list here for us of common mistakes that you might hit as a beginning beekeeper and how to maybe avoid them. The first thing to kind of touch on with that is too many hives too soon, right? The first time people get addicted to beekeeping, there's a spiritual attraction that people have to bees. I know that sounds far out to say, but what I like to tell people is that bees find you. You're going about your normal human existence, and all of a sudden you find yourself attracted to reading about these crazy insects that are connected to the sun and are pollinating and producing food in abundance for all of us. And you're just drawn to them. You're just following them. And all of a sudden you have 2 hives behind your house, and then you have 4, and then you have 10, and then you have 20, and then you're doing this as a, you're spending thousands of dollars on colonies and hives and equipment, and it gets out of control fast. I want to encourage you as a beginning beekeeper, avoid getting too many hives too quickly. Master the little things, master the details. How can I be a perfect beekeeper? Not how can I have as many beehives as possible? It's way more amazing to meet a beekeeper who has 4 hives and they all survive the winter than someone who has 25 hives and 2 survive the winter. Because the person who has 4 hives that survive, they're getting more honey than the guy who had 25 hives go through the winter and they all died. That's a big thing to think about is the right amount. And if you have too many colonies in one location, you can deal with things like diseases, varroa might spread, lack of forage, and lack of honey production. In my area in New Jersey, I would say no more than 10 hives in one place. Preferably, I would say 6 to 8 hives in one location. And that in the next apiary I establish will not be within 10 miles or 5 miles of that starting apiary that I have. So that's the first thing. Next thing is going to be your management system. How do you manage your bees? Why are you managing your bees? What are you doing? When are you doing it? A lot of beekeepers neglect creating a management schedule. With vegetables, I would never just plant things willy-nilly. I would never just plant carrots today and tomatoes tomorrow and maybe grow some lettuce over there. I have a planting schedule where I plant throughout the whole course of the farm season certain crops, and I'm going to harvest them at certain times. Likewise with bees, you need to know, depending on the spring, the summer, the fall, the winter, what are you doing and why are you doing it? What is your management schedule? What are you expecting to do today? So establishing an important management schedule is critical, and that is done by learning about how bees work and what's happening at the different times of year. For example, in the spring, bees are building up. They're collecting a lot of forage. They're bringing in nectar. They're bringing in pollen. That means I'm checking my hives to add more equipment so that bees can grow rapidly and fill out that equipment. I might also be feeding sugar water in the spring because the weather's warming up. They need more food. They're bringing in their own nectar, but they also need that boost of sugar. In the summer, I'm not feeding sugar. I want to slow down my addition of equipment depending on how the summer is going. If they're still bringing in nectar in July, I'm going to add more honey supers so I can get honey production. But if the flow of nectar is waning, I'm not going to add more equipment. In fact, I'm going to go on the defensive and get careful of the fact that robbing can start to happen in August when the flow of nectar and pollen has reduced. In fact, if I crack open a hive in August and leave it open for too long, I can inspire a robbing frenzy in my apiary. And then likewise in the wintertime, we have the fall and winter, we have things that we need to do then. So what is your management system? Why are you doing what you're doing? What is your plan? Have a plan in advance of even buying beehives. Have a plan. Have all your equipment ready to go. So a lot of times beekeepers don't get all their equipment they need, and then they buy the bees and they have the bees, but they don't have all the Langstroth equipment they need, or they don't have all the bee suits they need, or they don't even have a plan of where they're going to store all this stuff. When you get to your apiary to do, even if it's in your backyard, there's things you need to always have with you. Things like a notebook and a camera. You're going to have sugar and a feeder on hand, a bucket, pre-marked bucket with a drill and an auger so you can mix sugar water on site if you need. Smoker and smoker fuel. You're going to need 2 hive tools because inevitably you lose one when you're working a hive, and you lose it to the degree that you need to just, if you don't have a second, you're using your car key to pry open the hives and put them back into position. Full suit and a half suit. In case things get a little hairy as a beginning beekeeper, you want a full suit on site so you can get into that, so you can finish the day beekeeping, or at least finish the activity you were doing rather than fleeing to your car. And also the equipment. You're going to normally have deep hive bodies and frames with you, medium supers with you. I mean, these are all things that you have to have a plan to bring with you in your car in advance, or have just nearby. There's other key things to mention. Quick ones would be chasing swarms. Chasing swarms is a common thing beginning beekeepers do, or being scared of swarming. What is swarming? It's the natural reproductive process of bees, right? Bees, just like all creatures, want to birth a being out. And in the springtime, that's when bees want to do that. Their colonies are booming. The hives are getting really packed with bees, and you're adding equipment. But even though you're stacking equipment, the bees still feel like they need more room. They need to grow. And often in the spring, bees will produce swarm cells or queen cells that are designed for swarming. Along the bottom of a deep frame, you'll see many, maybe 12, maybe 20 across the bottom of one whole deep box, different little individual swarm cells. And at that point, beekeepers will flip out. They'll be super scared. They're going to lose their bees. Oh my God, what do I do? The reality is you can't do that much. If bees want to swarm, they will swarm. They want to give birth. You can't really stop them, but you can encourage them to swarm in a way that works for you. So you can hang swarm traps around your apiary that the swarms will come out of your current hives and settle into the swarm trap, which means you've caught them and you can put them into a new hive. Or you can split the colony. You can take half of those swarm cells out, or all the swarm cells out, into a new colony that's queenless, and make your new your split off of that. So there's solutions, but to simply see a swarm come out and start flying away, and then you're in your car and you're chasing them and you're trying to figure out where they're going to land so you can put them in a box, that's too late, right? Once the bees have swarmed, if you don't have swarm traps up, they're gone. Let them go. If they're kind enough to land on a branch within 10 feet of the ground and they're nearby your car or your house, amazing, you can catch them. But chasing swarms is really not a healthy way to approach beekeeping unless they're available to you. Last 2 big mistakes is inspecting too much and knowing when to stop. Beekeepers, when they first start out, think, I have to go in that hive. I just need to know. I need to know what's going on. I recommend in the first year to inspect your colonies with a bee mentor as often as you can, because a bee mentor can give you context for what you're seeing. If you're not doing it with a bee mentor, have a plan for what you're looking for when you go in a colony. People will say, why are you inspecting a hive? The answer is, I'm looking for the queen. That's what every beginning beekeeper will say. I'm looking for the queen. Why? Why are you looking for? Why are you always looking for the queen? She was there a couple of days ago. You don't need to check, 4 days later. Certainly, every time you inspect, there's a point to look for eggs to see if the colony is queen right. And if you see eggs in there, that means the queen has been there in the last 3 days and laid those eggs, which means the colony is queen right, which is good to know. But you don't need to check for that every week. And inspecting too much can lead to a lot of negatives. You can crush the queen by accident by constantly removing frames and putting frames back in. You are splitting the colony open and making the bees disorganized, right? The bees have everything set up perfectly, exactly the way they want it, all sealed together with propolis. And then you come in twice a week, you get your tool in there, you leverage everything apart with the tool, you're pulling frames out, you're putting it back in. You may not be putting them back in the right order. And after you leave that moment of beekeeping, the bees have to sort themselves out again. You set them back. They're busy reorganizing and figuring out what just happened. And the smoker smoke is still in there, and that's dissipating out. So inspecting less, and when you are inspecting, knowing really what you're doing and why you're doing it, and setting a timer, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. How much time do you need to do this inspection and why? If you're just feeding sugar water, that should be no more than 5 minutes. If you're just checking if the hive is queen right, maybe you can do it in 15 minutes. If you're doing a full inspection where you're going through every layer of the hive once or twice a year to see the health of the hive, maybe that's 30 or 45 minutes. You should have a time limit, because if your inspection for one hive is running to 20 or 30 or 40 minutes, those bees get more defensive. They get more ornery. They get less happy to see you every time you visit, because every time you visit, you're destroying their home. You're going in, you're smashing their dishes, you're knocking over their couch. I mean, it's like, you got to be a steward, not just an invasive force in their lives. And just coming back to one more thing I want to mention, because we touched on it very briefly, is inspiring a robbing frenzy in the apiary. If there is a dearth period in August or in the early fall, when there's no forage or not enough forage and pollen, and you crack open a hive that's full of nectar and honey in your apiary, it will inspire a robbing frenzy. It will encourage bees from the neighboring hives that are right around that area to fly on over and say, oh, I smell honey. What's going on over here? And once they realize that hive is full of honey and nectar, they can overpower the guard bees at the front of that hive and just steamroll in and kill the hive through robbing. Because once they get in there and they take a little bit of honey out and bring it back to their colony, they're going to do a waggle dance and they're going to tell their colony, hey, the neighboring colony's got honey available for free, and all their foragers are going to find themselves going to that colony. And it's very hard to stop a robbing frenzy once it's occurred, and it can spread from one hive to the next. So do not make the mistake of causing a robbing frenzy. So be very cautious with how much you open your hive in the dearth period. The last big thing to mention is varroa mite management and making sure you have a good varroa mite management plan. What are you going to treat with at different times of the year? Are you going to do formic acid, oxalic acid? Are you going to use varroa-sensitive hygienic traits in your colony? Are you going to use drone traps? There's a multitude of different really great practices you can use to kill varroa mite in your colony, but having a plan for that is the way you avoid losing your colonies in the winter. A hive that goes into the winter with high varroa mite count will not survive the winter. So we need to be a beekeeper, but we also need to be an expert in varroa management as well.
This is it's really intense. Every time we talk about bees, I'm always amazed at how much there is to consider, and we could have talked another 3 hours and talked about some of those procedures, right? Of like, okay, how do you actually go in and, and how do you smoke and what is smoke doing and when do you use it? Can I rely on this? There's a lot of stuff. And, other questions come up, like how much honey can you expect? From two hives, and when you say two hives, we're talking about two boxes, right? Two individual boxes, maybe stacked on top of each other, and that's what you're calling two hives. Is that what?
Right. So that would two Langstroth hives would be, each hive would have a bottom board, would have two deeps, which are, or otherwise known as brood chambers, which are where the queen bee is spending most of her life laying eggs, raising pupa, eggs, larvae, and pupa in there. There's things like pollen and bee bread stored in there, as well as nectar and honey. So two deeps. And then above that would be honey supers. Usually you'll get 2 or 3 per hive per year. And those 2 or 3 are going to be in your second year of raising a hive. The first year, you're just going to be raising a hive to size. Your goal is to get them to a size and weight that they'll survive the winter. So a winter hive should weigh about 155 to 160 pounds. When it goes through the winter, that means it's going to survive the winter. We weigh our hive by using a luggage scale. You can hook it on the back of a hive and tilt the hive up to equilibrium. And so once you hit that equilibrium point where you're holding all the weight on the luggage scale, tilting the hive forward, you then double that weight. So if I lift it up and I get to 70 pounds on the luggage scale, that's telling me that 2 times that is the weight of the hive, because I'm only taking half the weight. I'm not picking the whole hive up. So 70 pounds would be 140 pounds. So my goal is 155 to 160 pounds per hive through the winter. And again, it's 2 deeps, going to be 3 honey supers. if you had a mature second year hive that was producing honey, we're going to get about, I would say, in a good year, maybe 90 to 100 pounds of honey, maybe 60 pounds of honey per hive. And that is roughly equivalent to, I think it's about 1 5-gallon bucket or 2 5-gallon buckets per hive of honey. And that's a good ratio. Taking more than that, you're risking starving the bees through the winter. And it's not easy to get that, because if you're really raising hives in a sustainable way, it takes time. It takes 2 years before you're getting that 1 bucket of honey out of that hive. So you're gonna have to have patience on that journey.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe that's something that we can address because just there's so much that we haven't discussed that we could go into detail on. Haven't even talked about marketing, honey, or anything, right? We're basically talking about how do you get set up. But some of these conversations I think we can have, in other episodes where we can dig into some of these procedures and what we might expect and how to harvest, right? And how much do you leave behind, right? Because
Yep,
you're taking their food that they made, right? So how do we harvest and not encourage them to leave, I guess. So there's an awful lot
absolutely.
we could talk about, but this is fantastic.
So a big part of the beekeeping industry, if not the most profitable part today, is pollination services, shipping honeybees in a migratory fashion, in large scale around the United States to pollinate different blossoms, such as the almond. The largest single pollination event, I believe, in the world is the almond pollination event in California out west. Every beekeeper in the United States that's on a larger scale will ship their bees there to pollinate almonds. Then they'll cycle them around the United States to do apples. And we're not talking a small scale guy. Like, even the biggest beekeepers I know, which maybe are doing 400 hives, 300 hives, are small compared to the gentlemen and ladies who are sending hives to California. These are beekeepers that are raising 4,000, 5,000, 10,000 hives, and they ship them around the United States. It is not good for the health of a bee to be eating one type of food. They need to, just like as a human, kale might be great for us, but if we ate kale only every day, 3 meals a day, we would not be healthy, right? We're missing micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, and just proteins, all sorts of other things that we're getting from different plants. So, different foods. Bees are the same way. They need a diverse diet of different types of forages, so they're not going to be healthy living on one. However, when people market buckwheat honey, it's typically because that honey was made predominantly from buckwheat, because at that time of the year when those bees were in that farm, that the buckwheat was blossoming. And so bees were all over that buckwheat, and the 90% of the nectar in that honey is buckwheat honey, and or buckwheat nectar, which has become buckwheat honey. And what the beekeeper will do is he'll harvest that specific color honey and at that time of year to market it as such, as buckwheat honey. So it doesn't necessarily imply that hive is unhealthy. It's just that hive at that time of year was pollinating a ton of buckwheat, and so that beekeeper is able to market a buckwheat honey product because they can see the dark color of the buckwheat honey, and they harvest it and extract it then before the bees move on to another forage of their farm area. Not all single source honeys are migratory bee honeys, for example. One of my favorite types of honey is lavender honey. Lavender farms that raise bees have this just a delicious, fragrant, dark, bluish honey that'll come out of a lavender farm. That doesn't mean the hive is unhealthy. It means they're just predominantly at that time of year foraging on that plant. And you know what? For beekeepers, particularly sideliners and hobbyists like I am, it's a great way to make money because people will pay additional price for a single source unique honey than just a general wildflower mixed honey. Even some beekeepers will go even a little farther and just say, fall blend or mountain flower blend or summer wildflower blend. All these are marketing, and it's a great way to make a little extra dough on the side just to sell it at a premium.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. I wish we had more time, man. Guys, this is great just to sit here and talk bees. Again, like I said, I learn so much every time we talk. Can we have you back to do this again, Eric? And we can dive a little deeper onto some of these marketing things and maybe kind of explaining a little bit deeper some of the equipment that you were talking about and how it's used and some other options that folks can do whenever they get into this. Appreciate
I would love it. I would love it, Lee. I hope that, if we have a good feedback from our NCAT and ATTRA audience of farmers and beekeepers, I would love to do more of these. And for any beekeepers out there that are listening to us today, if you have thoughts, questions, statements, or contrarian ideas on what I was saying today, please email me at ericf@ncat.org. You can also find us on our website, ncat.org, or attra.ncat.org. And I'd be happy to talk with you more and provide guidance and also discussion around these topics.
Very cool. Well, again, bro, we really appreciate it. This has been great. It's been a great conversation. Why don't we put this to bed? Thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this delve into beekeeping. We'll see if we can do some more. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.